Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on 21st century domestic challenges. The core question is this: what happens to self-government when every major crisis becomes a referendum on whether any institution deserves to be believed? The core competency is to compare the domestic challenges faced by Americans in the 21st century with those of the previous century. What happens to self-government when every major crisis becomes a referendum on whether any institution deserves to be believed? That question is the proper entry into 21st century domestic history. The problem is not a shortage of events. The problem is that recession, healthcare, protest, platform politics, policing, pandemic, and election distrust all ran through the same damaged circuits of legitimacy. Older American conflicts remained intact. Who pays, who governs, whose evidence counts, and what obligations citizens owe one another. The difference in the 21st century was speed. A mortgage collapse could become a national panic in days. A police killing caught on video could become a mass protest before official reports were written. A virus could force governors, hospitals, employers, schools, and families into simultaneous improvisation. A rumor could move faster than the agency trying to correct it. The institutions were asked to do more while being trusted less. Domestic challenge in this period meant administrative strain under informational fragmentation. Congress could pass a health law, but websites, subsidy calculations, state cooperation, and court review would decide whether the law felt real. Federal agencies could declare an emergency, but procurement failures, school closures, hospital shortages, and partisan media would shape whether citizens experienced the declaration as protection or theater. Citizens could organize against police violence or sexual abuse, but the platforms carrying testimony also carried distortion, counterattack, and exhaustion. The civic problem is direct. A democracy can survive disagreement over policy. Can it survive when disagreement extends to basic confidence in elections, public health, courts, universities, policing, and even shared facts about what has happened? The early 21st century domestic order rested on unstable foundations even before the COVID emergency. Housing finance had been expanded through mortgage securitization, derivatives, aggressive lending, and the assumption that home prices would keep rising. Employer-based health insurance still left millions exposed to job loss or unaffordable care. Wage growth for many workers lagged behind the gains enjoyed at the top of the income scale. Digital platforms were beginning to reorganize attention before most public institutions understood how that change would work. The financial crisis of 2007-2008 exposed the fragility directly. Mortgage-backed securities failed, major financial institutions faced collapse, and credit markets froze. The Troubled Asset Relief Program, Federal Reserve lending, and later stimulus measures prevented deeper collapse, but they also produced a durable political wound. Many households watched foreclosures, layoffs, and retirement losses spread, while large institutions received extraordinary rescue. The old American complaint that power protects itself gained fresh evidence. Healthcare revealed a different version of the same problem. Before the Affordable Care Act, coverage depended heavily on employer plans, Medicare, Medicaid, or individual purchase, under rules that often excluded pre-existing conditions or priced ordinary people out of security. Emergency rooms absorbed unpaid care. States and hospitals managed patchwork burdens. Medical bankruptcy and coverage instability turned illness into a financial risk as well as a bodily one. Reformers had spent decades trying to widen access without replacing the entire private insurance structure. That background explains why the ACA did not emerge into a neutral system. It emerged into a system already famous for complexity and unequal protection. The constitutional order also carried accumulated friction from the late 20th century. Federalism gave states large influence over education, policing, elections, and health administration. Courts could widen or narrow the reach of national law. Congress had become more polarized and less institutionally confident. Media fragmentation accelerated through cable, talk radio, internet forums, and later platform feeds driven by attention metrics. By the 2010s, a local event could enter national politics almost instantly, but the institutions asked to verify, interpret, or govern that event still moved on slower clocks. The labor market underneath those institutions was also changing. Union density in the private sector had fallen for decades, leaving more workers in service jobs with weaker benefits and less predictable schedules. State budgets leaned on sales taxes and local property revenue that rose and fell with housing markets. County election offices, public health departments, and school systems were expected to handle growing technical burdens with staffing levels that had often been trimmed after recessions. Administrative fragility existed before the next crisis hit, and that fragility shaped how every later emergency felt on the ground. Alternatives were visible at several points. Banking regulation might have tightened earlier. Health reform might have moved toward a simpler single-payer model or toward stronger public options. Social media governance might have been approached as infrastructure rather than as an afterthought to advertising. Those alternatives remained politically divided, and the actual system carried forward a familiar American habit: layered reform without structural simplicity. The Affordable Care Act of 2010 is the clearest case of 21st century domestic governance as complicated architecture. The law expanded Medicaid, created insurance exchanges, subsidized purchase for many households, prohibited denial for pre-existing conditions, and required extensive reporting, enrollment, and regulatory coordination. The aim was social protection without fully nationalizing insurance. That made the law administratively dense by design. Federal agencies had to write rules. States had to decide whether to build their own exchanges or rely on the federal marketplace. Insurers had to price plans under new conditions. Employers, hospitals, and households all had to learn the system. The 2013 launch of healthcare.gov exposed how easily policy legitimacy could be damaged by implementation failure. Contractors struggled, databases failed, identity verification systems jammed, and the website crashed under pressure. Opponents treated the rollout as proof that government could not manage complexity. Supporters had to argue that design failure and policy purpose were not identical. The law survived, but it survived as a daily administrative argument rather than as a settled social guarantee. The Supreme Court's decision in NFIB versus Sebelius in 2012 made Medicaid expansion optional for states, which meant geography shaped citizenship again. A poor adult's access to care now depended heavily on which state government controlled the map around them. Hybrid reform is politically easier to pass than total reconstruction because it preserves insurers, employers, and existing benefit channels, but it is also easier to attack because every form, website, premium jump, and state refusal becomes evidence against the system. The same architecture that makes compromise possible also multiplies points of breakdown. Distrust after the Great Recession moved in different ideological directions at once. The Tea Party denounced bailouts, taxes, and federal overreach, using town halls, cable media, donor support, and electoral primaries to punish Republican moderates and block Democratic expansion. Occupy Wall Street denounced inequality, financial impunity, and the language of rescue for institutions rather than families. These movements disagreed sharply, but both emerged from the sense that the rules were serving insiders first. The next major pressure wave came through policing and public testimony. The deaths of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and many others pushed local policing into national judgment. Smartphone video and platform circulation changed the relation between event and audience. A three-word protest slogan could begin with a hashtag and become an organizational frame, connecting marches, bail funds, local demands, abolition arguments, budget fights, and electoral pressure. Police departments responded with force posture, curfews, riot gear, surveillance tools, body camera promises, and union defenses of officer discretion. Municipal governments confronted a difficult bind: maintain order, defend legitimacy, and answer citizens who no longer accepted official accounts at face value. The Me Too wave used similar media acceleration in a different field. Testimony about harassment and assault spread across workplaces, universities, entertainment industries, and newsrooms. Human resources offices, corporate boards, prosecutors, and journalists all became sites of judgment. The issue was not whether abuse existed before platform circulation. The issue was that gatekeepers lost some control over when accusation became public crisis and when institutions had to respond. COVID-19 forced the most intense domestic administrative strain since World War II. The virus moved through a federal system with uneven hospital capacity, fragmented public health authority, partisan media, and supply chains optimized for efficiency rather than reserve. The March 2020 National Emergency Declaration opened legal flexibilities, but it did not by itself produce coherent procurement, testing capacity, or trusted messaging. Governors issued stay-at-home orders on different timetables. County health departments improvised tracing and guidance. School districts shifted to remote instruction with wildly unequal broadband access and family support. Hospitals rationed protective equipment and intensive care space in early surges. Nursing homes, prisons, Native communities, service workers, and low-income households faced different forms of exposure and loss. Congress responded with enormous fiscal measures, including the CARES Act of March 2020, unemployment expansion, stimulus checks, and business support. Those measures prevented deeper collapse, but speed carried confusion and fraud risk. Small businesses scrambled for Paycheck Protection Program access. State unemployment websites failed under volume. Parents became unpaid logistics managers for remote schooling. Vaccination later added another layer of authority conflict around mandates, employer policy, school governance, and the expertise claims of agencies. Election administration entered the same pressure cycle. The 2020 election required absentee ballot expansion, new curing procedures, poll worker recruitment during a public health emergency, and litigation over deadlines, drop boxes, and counting rules in states such as Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Georgia. Secretaries of state, county clerks, and local canvassing boards became national targets of suspicion. Routine administrative acts like signature matching, machine certification, and recount procedure moved from county offices into cable broadcasts and online conspiracy traffic, which turned basic election management into another test of whether institutional process could survive mass distrust. The same years also forced domestic politics to absorb climate pressure, housing strain, and election distrust without ever receiving one quiet season for institutional repair. Wildfire smoke, heat waves, hurricane recovery, insurance withdrawal, rent spikes, and supply chain shortages all intensified the sense that government was expected to respond everywhere at once, while confidence in its competence kept thinning. That accumulation defines the 21st century domestic problem as more than one isolated failure. It is the layering of emergencies on top of already contested authority. The public argument kept circling back to the same pressure point. Was emergency rule proof that government remained indispensable, or proof that it remained too clumsy and distrusted to act without intensifying division? President Donald Trump's March 13, 2020 proclamation declaring a national emergency is a revealing primary source because the phrase sounds decisive while masking fragmentation underneath. Emergency language does real work. It can free funding streams, loosen procurement rules, trigger statutory authorities, and signal that routine procedure has been suspended in favor of speed. In a fast-moving public health crisis, those powers change state action. Yet the source is tactical precisely because declaration and delivery are not the same thing. A proclamation does not manufacture masks, build trust, align 50 governors, synchronize school districts, or settle disputes among employers, hospitals, unions, and local officials. It announces seriousness. It cannot guarantee coherence. That gap between announcement and execution defines much of 21st century governance. The wording also shows how modern presidencies try to inhabit both control and distance. By declaring an emergency, the White House claims leadership. By operating through a federal system with dispersed authority, it also shares or shifts responsibility when outcomes diverge. Citizens then experience a strange combination. Executive language at the top, fragmented reality below. On agency letterhead, in governor briefings, and across televised press conferences, the proclamation sits inside a larger pattern. The ACA, post-recession rescue, platform-era protest, and COVID response all reveal institutions that can still act at scale, but rarely in ways that feel simple, uniform, or fully legitimate. The declaration is a weapon of activation rather than a promise of trust. The major domestic consequence of the 21st century so far is that Americans now meet nearly every large problem as a fight over institutional credibility. Healthcare is no longer only coverage design. It is a test of whether the state can organize risk fairly. Policing is no longer only a municipal service. It is a test of whose testimony counts and whose safety is recognized. Platform politics is no longer only communication technology. It is a test of whether democratic visibility produces accountability or permanent distortion. Pandemic response is no longer only health administration. It is a test of whether expertise can command obedience when trust has already been spent. That condition has historical roots in federalism, unequal citizenship, and suspicion of concentrated power. What changed in this century was velocity. Crises stacked before institutions finished processing the last one. Relief and backlash arrived together. Courts, school boards, governors, and platforms all become national actors, whether they wanted the role or not. Citizens now experience governance in tighter loops: the policy, the clip, the outrage, the lawsuit, the counterclaim, the next emergency. A democratic public can survive conflict. It has done so before. The more disturbing possibility is a public that still demands protection, relief, and fairness while no longer granting enough shared legitimacy to any institution asked to deliver them. If that is where the country now stands, then the next emergency will not ask only what government can do. It will ask who, if anyone, the country still trusts enough to let government do it.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.